Morning, everybody. We're here at the Vitality Project this morning for our group meeting. I'll keep my eye on anybody joining us. In the meantime, I think what I want to share with you are some things that I've been addressing the last few days as a function of my wanting to research out and serve as a resource for anybody who wants to come to the Vitality Project, a resource for our dealing with the current coronavirus pandemic. So I have some further thoughts, and this will continue to roll out over the next days. I'm also recording this right now for purposes of serving as a resource for anybody who can't make the meeting, who might be able to come to it later. Just as we've dealt with addiction and recovery here at the Vitality Project from a holistic perspective, and for shorthand, that's really looking at ourselves as human beings, as physical bodies, having our own thoughts and emotions and relationships, that would be our minds psychologically, and also that we're all endowed with spiritual longings, aspirations, goals. And so we talk about our humanity in terms of body, mind, spirit. And I try to take that as seriously as I can so that any conversation about any element of addiction of any kind, that it includes at the very least a body, mind, spirit kind of attentiveness. There's a lot of focus, and I think it's understandable, and I think it's well applied. There's a lot of focus in general in the recovery community. There's a lot of focus on addiction as a spiritual problem. So looking at addiction from a spiritual perspective, and then that whatever solution is to come itself will be spiritual. And that makes a lot of sense to me, and I completely support that. A couple of thoughts about that. One is that I feel like that as long as we hold spirituality in the context of body and mind, then we maintain fidelity to kind of the breadth of who we are as human beings, as for that matter, as well as the depth. And that any spirituality that we develop in our lives, which is incredibly important across our lives, is itself founded on biological integrity, physical wellness, which brings us face to face with the virus right now, and also psychological integrity. I think of psychological integrity being primarily, just for simplicity's sake, reducible down to the domain of our emotional lives and our relationships. Psychology certainly studies more than that, but you get the biggest part of the pie in terms of its relevance to addiction and certainly recovery by looking at our emotional lives, the ups and downs, as well as our relationships, the ups and downs. And so that any focus on spirituality, for example, in the context of addiction and recovery, that emphasizes spirituality makes sense to me, as long as we realize. I remember years ago chairing a dissertation. The student's name was Juan Perez. He's back in contact with me after 30 years or so. His doctoral dissertation was looking at the intersection between spirituality, psychology, and biology. And the phrase that Juan used in his dissertation is that biology has priority, as does psychology, and spirituality has supremacy. I slightly altered that to fit this conversation, but the basic idea is that if you think of it like a pyramid, that the foundation of the pyramid is the biological, the next level of the pyramid in this middle zone is the psychological, and the apex of the pyramid, that which is supreme, is spirituality. It's a helpful way to understand the intersection, I think, between the physical domain, our biological health, the psychological domain, our thoughts, emotions, and relationships, and the spiritual. So I'd want to challenge any perspective that precludes, in addition to spirituality, taking a long, hard look at psychological well-being. I'm just checking my messages here to make sure there's no one who's trying to get on here. Okay, all right. There's another issue I want to bring up, and then I'm going to begin to weave this back in terms of our talking about how we deal right now with this pandemic, is that just as spirituality is vital in the context of a holistic perspective, it's also vital, it seems to me, to embrace as much diversity in spirituality as possible. So I've attempted over the last weeks and months to define spirituality in a way that's broad enough and deep enough to embrace everybody and transform everybody. And so I think of breadth. What I mean by this is that spirituality for one person might be in the form of a Christian belief system. For another person, it might be in the form of a Buddhist or a Hindu belief system or Jewish. And for another person, it might be in the form of an agnostic or atheistic perspective. And you might think, well, how is atheism or agnosticism, for that matter, how are those even possibly related to spirituality? Well, I think that I can answer that, is that if we define spirituality as representing whatever it is in our lives that represents our ultimate value, that which directs us, our North Star, whatever it is that provides purpose for our existence on this planet in the brief years that we're given, whatever is of deepest meaning to our lives, what provides meaning, then I think we get ourselves into the zone of talking about spirituality in a way that doesn't require, for example, belief in a personal God, which the three great monotheisms do. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, all believe in a personal God. But you have major world traditions on this planet right now. For example, 500 million people on this planet would designate themselves as Buddhists, and Buddhism is a non-theistic religion. Hinduism is a polytheistic religion. We can just go down the list. And so if we're going to be inclusive, and then you have a large population, increasingly a large population of each successive generation, particularly in this age of information and scientific progress, that don't believe in the conventional or orthodox faith traditions and yet find a basis for spirituality. I'll mention one kind of catch-all term, is that New Age spirituality oftentimes is not recognizably monotheistic, nor does it necessarily believe in a personal God, but you'll have people talking about praying to nature or the universe, and with deep reverence. And so whatever that is, at the end of the day, whatever it is that guides us through our day, that gets us into the realm of a spirituality that's robust enough to hold steady through thick and thin. So my plea to anyone who works in addiction recovery, as well as anyone who's moving into recovery themselves, is that we have a broad enough spirituality to embrace everybody, and a deep enough spirituality, and by deep I mean has the capacity to transform our lives in significant ways. And then I think I'm on board with you. I think I'm on board with you in terms of spirituality being absolutely essential in addiction recovery. Now, I promised to weave this back into the current situation with the global coronavirus pandemic. I'm at home today in my office. You can see familiar books behind me if you've been with me in previous video posts or previous group meetings here at the Vitality Project, and plan to be home for the next few days. My wife is also at home. We're working here today from home. I'll be having online sessions with clients all over the planet. And so we'll call in, and we're having to be a little bit creative in terms of providing services. I'm particularly mindful of this for anybody who's vulnerable to, well, we're all vulnerable to infection with this virus, but some of us, I'm within a few weeks of turning 65, and need to be especially careful just because of my age and the diminished immune system functioning that goes with natural aging. So I'm at home today, and I've been home this weekend doing a fair bit of research and also a fair bit of writing, as well as video recording resources to deal with this virus. And I'm going to focus primarily on resources from a psychological and from a spiritual perspective. I don't mean at all to negate or neglect the biological. In fact, most of the reading that I've done, and you probably too, if you're like me, have been reading as much as you can online to try to gather information from the Center for Disease Control here in the United States, or any other resources that are reputable. about trying to understand just the biology of a virus, of an epidemic moving into a pandemic, etc. I've begun publishing, or at least forwarding, certain articles that I feel like are well-founded scientifically and also can be helpful. I've been publishing these on my public Facebook group for Vitality Project, as well as the public Facebook page for myself, for Robert Weathers. Maybe we start there, is that one of the things that we can do is keeping a close eye on our anxiety here. All of us have a right to be worried. There wouldn't be a person who's in the know right now, as far as I can imagine on the planet, who isn't feeling more anxiety than perhaps is normal, and in some ways maybe ever before. I'm aware that in my own lifetime, there's no precedent for the government, education, political, economic shutdown, really moving, kind of hunkering down here, that's affecting all of us in the United States and all of us all over the planet. Presumably, there's no precedent for this in my lifetime. And so why wouldn't anxiety get stirred? Anytime novelty of this nature, especially when it's a worrisome novelty, is introduced, it makes sense that worry will increase, and that can lead to increasing anxiety. And so we have to keep an eye on that. So first of all, I would ask you to pay a special attention to how you're doing with all of this. A quick litmus test for this is just on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being completely relaxed, which I dare say that very few of us are, 10 being completely stressed out, just in a panic, full-on panic. On a scale of 1 to 10, just right now, where would you plot yourself in terms of anxiety? This is sometimes referred to as the subjective units of distress scale, SUDS, just for short, subjective units of distress scale. And it's a handy way to kind of monitor how we're doing. And in fact, the only one that really has access to your interior well-being, your sense of things emotionally, psychologically, is you yourself. No one can examine that from the outside. Sure, somebody can study your elevations in stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol, but to understand what's really going on inside of you requires you self-reflecting and being honest with yourself. So let's start with that. And let's assume that for all of us right now, that our anxiety might well be higher than our normal baseline. I don't think that that's a stretch to assume that. Then what's to be done about that? So if we look biologically at just our biological state right now, where elevated stress hormones leads to a subjective sense of increasing worry, is that in a chronic state of worry, it can actually settle into anxiety. And if you amp that up, if you ratchet that up, it'll manifest as full-blown panic. So what can we do to forestall that happening? Well, there's a few suggestions I'll be making in video posts that I'll be releasing over the next few days here at the Vitality Project. Actually, I'll be releasing them online generally. They'll be included in the archives here at the Vitality Project. One of the first things we can do is manage one of the strongest relationships in psychology. I learned this 40 years ago in psychology, and it's the relationship between cognitive ambiguity on the one hand, which is not knowing what the heck's going on. Let's just call it confusion or ignorance on the one hand, the correlation between that on the one hand and increasing anxiety on the other hand. When we don't know what's going on, we get more and more anxious. I know this is common sense, but bear with me because we're leading to some practical applications here. Is that to the extent that I am in the dark about what's going on, whether it's understanding the virus scientifically, whether it's knowing what's going on locally, regionally, nationally, internationally, in terms of responses to the global pandemic. Anything that I can do to educate myself is cash in the bank in terms of helping to regulate or modify increasing anxiety. So I highly recommend our staying open to educating ourselves. Now, this is where it gets dicey in this day of online access to information, is, as you know as well as I, is that I think of it in terms of a bell-shaped curve, there's probably the biggest bulk of information is somewhere in the zone of being okay, maybe not great, not bad. And then there's some information that is just really not founded at all in any findings, scientific or otherwise. And then there's the information that's probably the gold standard information, kind of the two ends of the two tails of that normal curve. I vote for picking for the best information possible. And so I would recommend that you clue in, you can do this online, for starters with the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, out of Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States. They'll have the most validated information, and they'll refer you to other information. For example, I read just this morning a study, and I'm still trying to sort out the technical parts of it, a study that was done by Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. I happen to know that Johns Hopkins School of Public Health is perhaps the best school of public health on the planet. My mom was a public health nurse, and I learned this from her, and I followed their research over the years. And just this morning, and by the way, I forwarded this particular study to my public Facebook page for my name, and I'll soon enough place it also on Vitality Project, was a study looking at the incubation period of this virus and why it makes sense for us to hunker down for a couple of weeks in order to not aid in the spread of the virus. And it's a technical article. It's a research article from Johns Hopkins, but it can be very satisfying, even at a cursory understanding, to have a rationale for why it makes sense to minimize contact or exposure to anybody who might be carrying the virus right now. And part of what's confusing, the article talks about this, is the virus can be dormant in terms of symptoms and still be active in the person's body. And so it's quite possible for somebody to be carrying the virus and for it not to be visible or discernible physically. It's not yet manifest as symptoms. And for some people, it might well manifest as very mild symptoms. And so it's hard to use outer symptoms as a guide for understanding if somebody's infected or not. Hence, the goal would be to really hunker down, minimize as much as possible contact with other individuals. I've also included here on the Vitality Project links to several articles by individuals such as Dr. Judson Brewer. I think he's at Brown University now, used to be at Yale, who's not only an addiction recovery expert, but has lots of resources available online in terms of how to manage the stress. We'll be talking more about that related to addiction. I've also included several resources online that just talk about very practical things we can do. This is stuff that you've heard probably ad nauseum, but not irrelevant to our staying healthy, in terms of washing of hands, washing of surfaces, maintaining so-called social distance and so on. I won't review all of those right now. Those are readily available, but you can find a tremendous amount of these resources at a reputable site such as the Center for Disease Control, and I would start right there. As soon as it moves out into the popular press, then once you tap into our people's anxiety, in some cases panic, and information can get distorted. It's a little bit like the telephone game, if you remember ever playing that. One person says a bit of information, let's say about the virus, passes it to the next person. That next person slightly shifts the information. And by the time you get around the entire circle, you end up with some claims about the virus that are patently not accurate, but certainly a function of what happens when human anxiety interacts with scientific information. So I really support getting aware of the biology or the medical foundations of this virus, but that's not enough. So what happens as we read this and we begin to feel anxious? So I read several articles that have talked about, for example, isolation itself can lead to increased distress for many of us, particularly people that are homebound a lot of the time anyway, particularly the elderly, for example, or those that are infirm physically. So how to manage that? I want to make several suggestions here, recommendations that you might consider. One is, I think it's really important to have some kind of arsenal available. And if you're starting from scratch, that's fine. An arsenal available of what I think of as self-calming exercises. This last week here at the Vitality Project, I published a whole series on mindfulness practice with very specific instructions. You can also go to YouTube and just look up my name, Dr. Bob Weathers, and find a whole series of resources on mindfulness practice there, including meditations of various lengths. And you can start there because you're familiar with me. One of the really rich resources that's available online is just up the road from where I live at UCLA up in Westwood here in Los Angeles. The Mindful Awareness Research Center, headed by Dr. Dan Siegel, one of the real leaders in research on mindfulness, is a treasure trove of meditations, practical suggestions, all kinds of suggestions for applying various ways of self-calming, applying yoga techniques, walking meditations, sitting meditations. As I've shared here over time, if you've been with me, I meditate when I swim. I swim most every morning. And you can meditate while you're washing dishes. You can meditate while you're ironing. You can meditate most anywhere. So whether it's progressive muscular relaxation or mindfulness exercises specifically, they're readily available, easily applicable, and directly tied into reducing our baseline stress levels. So in a time of, I just talked to my dear friend John Dupuy yesterday. John is the author of my favorite book in addiction recovery. The title of it is Integral Recovery. Integral Recovery. In fact, let me write that here in the chat. John's name is John Dupuy, and the title of his book is Integral Recovery. And in this book, John gives lots and lots of resources that you might consider for yourself that are particularly relevant right now. I just was on the phone at length yesterday with John, and he was reminding me that he says, Bob, when things get tough like they are right now, he says, I don't meditate less. You know where this is going. He says, I meditate more, and John does. In fact, just yesterday, I was talking to him after he had just completed a 4-hour meditation, which is pretty stunning, at home in his living room with his dog Lucy by his side. And so I think that there's a lot of resources that are important for us to remember, especially in a time of stress like this. What I'm thinking of, and this relates to kind of the intersection between the body and our emotions, I highly recommend physical exercise, not to forget about that, and just to exercise care with us. And so I hear locally, at least in the Los Angeles area, most gymnasiums and, exercise centers, various gyms have shut down. That doesn't negate our going for a walk, as long as we're careful about contact with other people. I plan later on today to, there's a severely steep set of stairs near where I live. I plan to go out and introduce a workout for cardio on those stairs. Helps to start easy so I don't injure myself. It's very steep. But we have to get creative about this. And so for sure, physical exercise is important, especially in a time where many of us are staying pretty close to home. My daughter and her husband are up in Central California. Unfortunately, they're traveling today from Central California back to their home in Texas. I'm very mindful of Amanda and Matt and their 2 children, my grandkids, Owen and Emma. And I got a text this morning from my son-in-law, Matt. He forwarded a YouTube video to me. I just got the biggest kick out of it. Matt knows that his wife, my daughter Amanda, and I have a deep love for the group Coldplay, and have since the very beginning when they came out with their very first album back in the late 90s. I was very much into following kind of independent pop music at that point, and Amanda and I were listening to Coldplay before they even had a hit on the radio. Their first hit wasn't out yet, and we followed them over the last 20 plus years and have seen them recently twice, including here locally. And Matt sent me a YouTube video of the leader of Coldplay, Chris Martin, who himself is hunkering down at home in front of his piano with his acoustic guitar, and sharing with anybody that has ears to hear, certainly Amanda and I do, his creativity and singing songs, unrehearsed, really rough cut. He's funnier than all get out. I really want to emphasize also, for the purposes of psychological well-being, that we get creative. Chris Martin's expressive form is primarily music, and it's quite wonderful. It's one of mine as well. One of the ironies for me is that next Tuesday, a week from today, was to be the next jazz gig for one of my jazz combos. We were playing locally at a local club here, and I was really looking forward to it. It's been since, I think, December since I played out and about. We had a bunch of group members traveling, and they're all back now. But unfortunately, we had to cancel that. We're going to postpone that performance till later in the spring. And I'm disappointed by that. So I can't play out. I love playing my drums, and I've loved playing for other people. But for obvious reasons, that's not going to work out. So I have to get creative. I have a piano here in this room. I have all kinds of ways of composing music on this computer that I'm talking into, and I can listen to music till the cows come home. And so I'm really immersing myself in music as a creative expression for me. But whatever that is for you, if you like to cook, if you like to paint or draw or sculpt, if you like movement, I have a dear friend, Angela, who lives up in Washington, who is a dancer and expert in movement therapy. She'll be moving through this time. It's an opportunity for us to find anything that we do regularly that helps to cultivate our well-being by connecting us with our souls, with that essential part of us that is creative. Let's not forget that right now. And, years ago, I taught at a local university, and I had a chance to teach with one of the, he is actually the father of modern behavior therapy. His name was Joseph Wolpe. He was on the faculty with me. I used to be so proud of this. And in the faculty handbook, there's a photograph of me, and right next to me, I'm Bob Weathers. There's Joseph Wolpe. So alphabetically, we're right next to each other. Well, I had studied Joseph Wolpe from the very beginning in psychology, way back, almost 50 years ago. Joseph Wolpe was initially from South Africa, and he really invented the foundations of modern behavior therapy, which has had such an impact, continues to have so much impact in psychology. And Joseph Wolpe was the one that developed this idea of what he called reciprocal inhibition. And roll forward several decades, and when I myself got into treatment and into recovery, including in the 12-step recovery program, there was talk about contrary action. It always reminded me of Joseph Wolpe's research on reciprocal inhibition. Well, what the heck is that? Well, what Joseph Wolpe postulated, and then researched it again and again to verify it scientifically, is that it's quite impossible. This will sound like common sense, but he studied it. It's quite impossible for us to be stressed and relaxed at the same time. To the extent I am stressed, I'm no longer relaxed. To the extent I'm relaxed, I'm no longer stressed. And so what we're talking about here is what the program, the 12-step program, calls contrary action. Do something different than what makes you feel bad, to put it in really common sense terminology. And so if our tendency here is to get stressed out and to ruminate about this viral pandemic, then let's use contrary action. Let's do something other than continue to kind of, as one client of mine said, I had an RN in therapy years ago. She says, Bob, none of us can barbecue in our own adrenaline. And I couldn't agree more. And so rather than barbecuing in our own adrenaline, let's exercise some creativity. And what might that be? Well, it's individual for each one of us. For me, it's very closely connected to music, as just one example. For you, it might be connected to some other self-expression. But when we engage with that, we engage with what the Hungarian psychologist, oh boy, here goes a mouthful. His name is Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. He's the inventor of the word flow. It's what we call being in the zone. And to the extent that I'm in the zone, to the extent I'm in flow, and I definitely get into flow around music and always have, is the extent to which I am delivered from the enslavement of anxiety. And so I highly, highly, highly recommend our engaging in activities that help connect us with our deepest self, our soul, and allow that to be medicinal during a time of increased stress. So we talked about ways of managing our body, including physical exercise and meditation. We've talked about ways to exercise creativity. Let me mention two others before we wind up for today. I haven't yet named the importance of our connecting with other people to help to manage our anxiety. We are social beings to the core. The most influential theoretical orientation and research tradition in the last probably 30 to 50 years in psychology is simply referred to as attachment theory. And attachment theory studies human relationships. That's the technical term for human relationships in psychology, is attachment. We attach to one another. it's a bit of a good news, bad news situation. Is that the good news is that connecting to one another, we can tap into resources that are very difficult to tap into alone. If you think about it, the most insidious, I think actually the most inhumane punishment of all in our prison systems is solitary confinement. People tend to deteriorate very rapidly in solitude. So here's one of the ironies, is that we're talking about increased solitude during a time of self-imposed quarantine. And in many countries, and perhaps soon enough in the US, maybe legislated, required, governmentally required quarantine. So in a time of solitude, what can we do to stay connected? Well, here we are. Thank goodness for resources such as online connectedness. And I highly, highly recommend our staying connected this way. I'll tell you a story that's near and dear and very fresh to my heart. One of my two longest term friends is Jim. And Jim's wife just passed away yesterday. Jim and Maureen were married for the better part of 30 years. And I knew Maureen the day that virtually the day that Jim met her. She's been quite ill for some time and she just passed away. Jim is, I believe, in the zone of 76 years old. I think he's 12 years older than I'm 64. And he's staying at home right now. Jim reached out to me after Maureen passed yesterday and we talked at length. And Jim is very much a part of my life, very much a part of my wife, Colleen's life, very much a part of my daughter's life. My daughter, Amanda, knows Jim through me. He's been an incredibly significant figure in my life for 4 decades. I'm so grateful for the fact that even as Jim and I are home and not able to go out, recommended not to go out, that we can maintain contact with each other. And I'll be reaching out to him every day over these next days and weeks. I would have done that anyway, but now it's mandatory that we reach out via telephone, via tablet, via computer, via online means, and we can do that. I have my other dearest long-term friend, Keith, has been severely ill also in the last several months, and we will be contacting each other. I was planning to go visit him this weekend. He lives several hours away. That's rendered impossible right now because of the recommended restrictions on travel. And so that's not possible. So what I can do, and I've already done, is reach out to Keith via online communication, particularly text communication and phone communication, to both Keith and his wife, Marlene. And so you may have examples like that. I hope you don't have examples that cut so close and also are so close to death for you. But in a time even of mourning, there's a way that we can reach out and support each other. Psychology suggests that we all have brains and they're all inside our heads, but that's not the only place that our brains are. We also have nervous system concentration in our chest area. I don't know if you can see that. And that's referred to as the heart brain. And it's particularly activated around what we're talking about in terms of connection. But we also share brains. That the technical term for that is co-regulation, is that my brain regulates yours and yours regulates mine. You all know how this goes, is that if you've ever been upset and had somebody come in and comfort you, your brain will actually begin to synchronize with their brain patterns that are soothing, calming. I said bad news, good news a minute ago, and I want to mention part of the risk here, though, in a time of anxiety and panic, is actually pick up on what psychology calls emotional contagion, which is you also know what it's like to be relatively calm and have somebody walk into your personal space who's very upset, and how difficult it can be to sustain your own sense of balance. So I have to be careful about emotional contagion here, that we keep ourselves grounded in a calm mind and a calm body, and that we reach out to others and share that with them. When I spoke to Jim yesterday, Jim was deeply centered. He lives in a deeply centered place, and I benefited from being with him even as he's just lost his wife just a few hours earlier. My friend Keith, the same way. We express sorrow about not being able to see each other, really deep regret. But there's a sense of loving connectedness despite that. And we can help others to join us by ourselves staying grounded and staying centered and then bringing that to others. I think this gets close to what I want to finish to talk about here today, and that is to address spirituality. If we understand spirituality as what gives our lives meaning and purpose, what serves as the essential or core value of our lives, then you can see that virtually everything I've been talking about is called upon. Maybe more so, as my friend John says, maybe more so in a time of a duress, great duress like this, and it's virtually universal. One of the things that gives me meaning and purpose right now is to keep myself in as calm and centered a space as possible, and then to reach out and be of service to others. I'm hoping to be that today with you here when you review this video. I lead 10 groups a week at local treatment centers, and I reached out to those treatment centers in the last yesterday and today to offer to them to provide online support for all of their clients, and for that matter, their staff, through the Vitality Project. My partner and I, Jason, have found a way to provide online support that is fully confidential, and we actually have the infrastructure at the Vitality Project. And so the intent, the wish here is to provide services to all of you who are listening in, as well as anybody who might be open to hearing this, who's yet to join. And so we'll be publishing a lot of our material online in public Facebook locations. And it's possible that I'll be able to provide some direct service to clients that I typically see face-to-face. And even though right now it's not advisable that I sit with them together in a room, I can sit with them online, just as I am with you right now. And so I think it's a time for us to rise to the occasion and to call on the deepest parts of ourselves, that part of ourselves that is compassionate, that part of ourselves that is whose peace is not contingent on outer circumstances. And in any other name, we're talking about our spirituality. Well, this is a start. We'll have further meetings this week. This is the first week since the coronavirus pandemic has been established as a national emergency here in the United States. That was preceded for sure in countries like China, Iran, Italy, other countries in Europe, France, and now the United States. And we're going to need to reach down inside for the deepest and best parts of ourselves. But I trust that, and I hope that this conversation here today and over the next week we'll be announcing upcoming group meetings on our membership side. Our next group meeting will be this coming Thursday evening, at 5:30. We'll be having daily Facebook Live events that will be published on our public page for Vitality Project, as well as my public page for Robert Weathers. I'll continue to create daily video posts and blog posts that will be information that will be made available to all. We have a discussion group that's a part of Vitality Project that I invite all of you to engage in. I respond to every single post, and so you can count on that. And really want to be available, so you're welcome to reach me through any of those means. I'm very committed to being fully responsive. I wish you all well during this time, and if we can remember that this situation is, while it's definitely a major test, it requires all of our bodily resources, all of our psychological resources, all of our spiritual resources, and that if we can hold together as a community, as a village of like-minded, compassionate human beings, that we can make it through this. And I trust that. And I hope that what we're doing at the Vitality Project contributes in some small way to our getting around the corner with this as soon as possible. I wish everyone here Godspeed, and I'll look forward to seeing you here online at the Vitality Project, or possibly in our Facebook Live events. Thanks for joining me, and take good care.